Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled to have you joining us. If this is the first time you're joining us for our weekly live Q&A show, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us, regardless of what your company does in the data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities ecosystem. Perhaps you're part of a data center operator like a hyperscale or co-location or edge provider, or perhaps you work in some facet of data center technology or data center facilities, or perhaps you're in the segment of the ecosystem that's related to construction, real estate and investment, or outsourced sales and marketing. But regardless of what your company does in the data center ecosystem, if you're looking to level up on your sales, marketing, and go-to-market, you are for sure in the right place. Even if you're in marketing or sales, like an account executive or a sales development rep or a business development rep or SDR, AE, BDR, or an account manager or customer success, or some facet of product or innovation or channel partnerships, or perhaps you are the leader, the executive who is responsible for going out and recruiting the best and the brightest to join your team, to give your company superpowers to prosper in this period of amazing growth globally in the data center industry. If this is the first time you're joining us, let us know in the comments what you do in the data center industry. If you've been with us before, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? First, we're going to look at how a data storage management and cloud services company can generate qualified opportunities. Second on our Q&A list for this week is how a modular data center developer generates leads. After that, we'll look at how a data center telecommunications and networking services company finds good salespeople. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center events business generates customer awareness. Then we'll look at how a hybrid cloud solutions provider improves marketing and sales. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center engineering firm creates long-lasting proof of concept with large corporations. If you have an idea for a topic or a challenge or a question that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So let's dive into this week's first question, which is, how does a data storage, management, and cloud services company generate qualified sales opportunities? That's an excellent question. And data storage and data management, for sure, in the technology part of the data center ecosystem. Over at DCSMI, we track 22 different data center technology related businesses that thrive in the data center industry. Cloud services is like right on the border between being in IT services, technology services, and being a data center operator. A lot of big public cloud services companies maintain their own data centers. Some cloud services companies rent space in other people's data centers. Some do both, or a lot of different arrangements going on here. But typically, data storage, data management, and cloud services covers both part of the data center technology and the data center operator parts of the data center industry. So for that kind of business, you're looking to generate qualified opportunities. So typically when you think about data storage, data management, and cloud services, you're talking about a company that has a couple different parts of its services, of its product line that it sells to its ideal clients. And what I always start with when we're given three different lines of business that could each potentially be their own business, it's super important to figure out how well integrated these lines of business are with each other and how well you're doing cross sells and upsells and customer marketing. And for many companies that over the years grow through acquisition, these potentially could have been three separate businesses. And part of the challenge when companies get married is to make sure that all three come together from an operations and a back-end technology perspective and from a marketing and sales and go-to-market perspective. Companies typically that build these kinds of products and services in-house organically usually have an easier time with that because at the minimum, there's no technical debt that they're trying to overcome. So for a company like yours, where we're going to hope that these are pretty well integrated, so it's one portfolio of products, one collection of products and services that your marketers and your sales and your account managers can offer to your clients. As long as most of your clients are a really good fit for all three, then we really can just have a single go-to-market playbook, a single sales and marketing strategy. If your company operates more in silos, where someone could almost make a case for at the current state at which you market, sell, and deliver these products, deliver these services, it almost feels like it's three different businesses, both from an internal and external perspective, then yeah, it's significantly more challenging. But as long as it is the same client base across the board, when it comes to generating qualified opportunities, what we're really trying to reverse engineer is your ideal client profile. And usually for a well-established company that's long past product market fit, long past go-to-market fit, it knows exactly who their ideal clients are, the mix of products and services they purchase, the price points, how long they stay, the durations, the margins, all of the basic unit economics. And you've done that at scale. You've hired over the years lots of sales development and business development reps, lots of account executives, lots of account managers. Most of those folks are meeting, exceeding quota. You have plenty of people that have been within the company for a number of years. So you have a mature, healthy, stable kind of business. As long as you have that, then we should be able to identify that ideal client profile, usually for this kind of business, just by looking at your website. If you have like a case studies section, if you have logos, testimonials, reviews, essentially what we're looking for is what is the common thread. Because when it comes to data storage, data management, and cloud services, usually these are products and services that can be delivered long distance. What that means is your ideal client profile, your ICP, your total addressable market, your TAM, could potentially be global. Doesn't have to be, but it could be. And when you look at data storage, data management, and cloud services, for sure, because you're in the IT services business, there will almost always be some compliance, accreditation, certification requirements that you need to have to do business in certain regions, and within those regions to do business within certain verticals or within certain industries. Like, for example, in many parts of the world, healthcare technology, very highly regulated. Financial services technology, very highly regulated. Government, education. So what it largely comes down to is when we look at that public representation of your typical clients, we're trying to get a really simple representation of that ideal client profile. In other words, where they're located geographically, which again depends not only on where you have coverage for latency reasons and their governance reasons, where you're able to do business because you're being waved in with a green flag as opposed to being held up with a red flag, based typically on credentialing to do business in that particular geographic region and that particular sector. What we also need to contend with, aside from the geographic part, whether it's global, whether you can serve an entire region of the world like Asia Pacific or the Americas, whether you're limited to just a few countries, beyond just the geographic parameters, it would be super helpful when it comes to qualified opportunities to get clarity on how big or small your best clients are. The big or small is a really big deal, and a lot of people gloss over this, and it's a huge problem when it comes to scaling your go-to-market, scaling your lead generation, scaling your opportunity generation, and scaling your sales process, both direct and indirect channel partner kind of sales processes. Their company size is a really, really big deal. Why? Because if you're selling for data storage, if you're selling data management, if you're selling cloud services, and you're to the point where you have enough scale where you can have self sign up that looks a lot like e-commerce, if you can have self onboarding where no one on your services team or your account management team needs to get involved in provisioning. You could potentially, if you have enough scale, decide that you want to be in the prosumer business. Prosumer's a collection of two words, professional and consumer, meaning these are typically SaaS, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service type of offerings that are sold at price points that are so low that even a part-time side hustle kind of business or SOHO, small office, home office kind of business, the extreme part of SMB, what's often called VSMB. SMB is small, medium-sized business. Sometimes when people put a V in front of it, they mean very small business, and usually that's 10 or fewer employees. So if your price point, if your self-service ordering, if your self-service provisioning, if your self-service support is at scale to the point where you can comfortably market and sell to all businesses, then maybe you don't have a lower limit. But typically for most companies that are in the platform as a service business, infrastructure as a service business, data storage management, cloud services, usually they're setting the entry point at like 10 employees, sometimes as many as 50 employees. In other words, like, your minimums. If you over time look at who your most successful clients have been, your 10 most profitable clients, your 10 happiest clients, your 100 happiest clients, or 1,000 happiest clients, whatever your scale is, try to back into like what the minimum size they need to be to really hit a great NPS, to hit a great net promoter score with you, to be very receptive to your initial value, intended value, extended value, to becoming great promoters of your company. Usually for most companies in the space, fewer than 10 employees, maybe a little too low. It's usually the low end of the entry point for like your small business offering is usually 11 to 50 employees, which in the US might equate to a company that has, say, anywhere between 1 million and 10 million in annual revenue, or your local currency equivalent. And then the extreme upper end of the range, that's your small business, and it's debatable depending on who you talk to, where large small business leaves off and where mid-market really starts. Most people generally take large small business up to about 200 employees or about 500 employees, and somewhere in that 200, 500-ish plus, you get to like mid-market. Where's the top of mid-market and where's the bottom of enterprise start? Depending on who you talk to, a lot of people start enterprise at 1,000 employees. Some people start enterprise at 5,000 or 10,000 employees. I want you to have clarity around these numbers. They're super important to dialing in your outbound prospecting, how you potentially run ads if you're using something like a LinkedIn Campaign Manager, certainly how you do your segmentation, your filtering strategy, and your CRM, your customer relationship management system, certainly how you decide when to just nurture leads versus hand off those leads to your sales team. So let's get really, really clear on how big or small your best qualified sales opportunities are. Maybe like in this example, it starts at 50 employees and it goes up to, say, 5,000 employees. Why did I pick 5,000? So I tend to find that most small to mid-sized companies, especially on the small to like your company size, your capabilities usually have some relationship with the upper end of the range of the size of clients you can work with. In other words, sure, in a perfect world, everyone would like to have famous brands on their website that they've sold to. They call that having a logo, right? The challenge is, if you're selling data storage, data management, and cloud services to a Fortune 500 company with 100,000 employees, and you're trying to also simultaneously sell those services to a 50-person accounting firm in your local area, or residential home builder or something like that with 50 or 100 employees, they have vastly, vastly different IT needs and vastly different price points. So the question is, can you really adequately service both with your current capabilities? What I tend to find, again, as companies in this category, they tend to hit a wall as they get into really large enterprise companies, unless they're an enterprise company themselves. Because when you get to the point that their IT department has hundreds or thousands of employees, because their company has hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of employees, a lot of times their IT requirements, their integration requirements, their financial requirements, their compliance, their insurance requirements, all the crazy hundreds of different stakeholders that potentially are using your IT services, it can really get out of hand pretty quickly. So I would encourage you, if you're relatively resource constrained, to really, really dial in that ideal client profile, especially the company size. Give that a lot of thought relative to your current product capabilities and your immediate future forward-looking product roadmap. And I would also, as I mentioned earlier, give some serious thought as to which verticals, which industries that you can do well within. Like mentioned before, if you have the capability to sell your data storage, data management, and cloud services and retain those kinds of clients and have happy clients in regulated industries, knock yourself out. Keep going after clients in those regulated industries, because not everyone that does what you do can successfully market and sell and service to those specific regulated industries. If there are regulated industries that you don't have the capability to sell to, well, you need to know about that as well. So you're not wasting time when you're doing things like outbound ads, lead generation, lead qualification. Certainly you want to know about that potential blocker long before your sales team invests their own resources in connecting, exploring, advising, and trying to move that opportunity forward. So those are some of the key considerations to think about at your ideal client profile. Usually, if you're serious about selling to large, small businesses in mid-market, at some point, the idea of account-based marketing, ABM, sometimes called account-based selling, ABS, is going to come up. And what that means is you have an ideal client profile, and for each rep on your team, they're given a finite list of accounts that fit that ideal client profile that you want them to work and create awareness among and advance some deals in and get some of those deals over the finish line so they generate new clients and generate new sources of revenue. So that target account list depends on where you're located, depends on how expansive your addressable market and your ideal client profile. But usually those lists are a couple hundred or a couple thousand companies, and you divide that up among different members of your team. And then within those accounts, it's also important to think about the individual stakeholders that tend to show up on the decision committees. The most important economic stakeholder on those decision committees will call your primary buyer persona. The second most important you call a secondary buyer persona. For a lot of companies that work in data storage, data management, and cloud services, IT services, sometimes your secondary or tertiary buyer persona, that third buyer persona, is a channel partner, sometimes known as a reseller, like a managed service provider, evaluated reseller, or a network integrator, or master agent, or something like that. But once you get below the account level, below the ideal client profile level, and you start to look at who are the kinds of people in those accounts who interact with your marketing resources, with your sales team, with your services team, it's super important to know what's going on in their world to get really client-centric. And the better job you can do with understanding the unique goals of that particular kind of stakeholder, of the primary, of the secondary, perhaps of the tertiary, the more likely it is that everything that you're doing will resonate. And by everything, I literally mean everything. If you go and try to build a website, and you try to build ads, and you try to build lead generation, lead magnets, if you try to build email marketing, if you try to do social media, if you try to have an event strategy, and you haven't first gotten clarity around that ideal client profile, those buyer personas and the goals and challenges that are going on in their worlds, a lot of times what you're talking about will just completely fall flat. So it's really important to understand how they articulate their goals and their challenges in their own words. Not what you think those words are, but how they actually express those, how they actually articulate those. Because if you really, really want everything that you're doing to resonate, it's really super important to be very interested in what they see as their big goals that directly or indirectly relate to data storage, data management, and cloud services, and that are a leading indicator that they're going to be in market in the coming weeks or in the coming months for your kind of data storage, data management, and cloud services. These are typically things that show up in their job descriptions, on how they describe their job on their LinkedIn profile, they're in their objectives and key results. Those you're not going to get access to unless you have a trusted relationship. But if you do everything right, you'll get the trusted relationship, and you'll get to these conversations where you'll learn about their goals that they're working on individually as a team and as a company. We also need to know what's driving them nuts, what's frustrating the heck out of them when it comes to anything and everything that's directly or indirectly related to storage management and cloud. And some of that can come from lead generation. Some of that can come from looking at the kinds of posts that they share on social media, especially in places like LinkedIn. Essentially, what we're trying to do is get x-ray vision as to what's going on in their mind that's directly or indirectly related to your category. And the better job you do with that, and if you can do face-to-face or Zoom interviews, great. If you have access to do a survey, that can be pretty good too. At the absolute minimum, for sure, you have access to your CRM, so you can look at past notes on how they've interacted with your company. And you for sure can look at a stack of LinkedIn profiles, of their social media footprints, of their search footprints, of what you find when you go search for information about that particular person in that job title at that particular company. And again, in that bucket, in that segment, we're looking to try to get the consensus on their biggest goals and challenges, where they hang out online and offline, and use that information to back into our lead generation and go to market strategy. I'm especially partial for this kind of business using a marketing, a sales strategy, a go-to-market strategy that helps you educate and build trust with these folks. You're selling to IT professionals 9 times out of 10, 95 times out of 100. Probably don't have to tell you that IT professionals don't trust marketing and sales folks. They don't. They're very technical. They're very skeptical. They're very cynical. And in order for us to break out of that vendor box, in order for us to shake that sales stigma, we have to be seen more as a peer. And the way we're seen more as a peer is to share super helpful information about how others in very similar job functions and very similar companies and very similar size companies in similar geographic regions have taken different kinds of approaches to achieve that kind of professional goal or overcome that huge challenge that they've articulated to you. And the better job you can do at that, the more likely it is that they're going to welcome you in onto their side of the table. What this means from a practical standpoint is, over time, we tend to see the account executives and the account managers that are hired by companies like this to come from a lot more of an IT background as opposed to traditional sales. So if you've been in this kind of role in this kind of company for a long time and you're getting this kind of pushback, a lot of your peers are investing pretty aggressively in training and certifications. In many cases, your employer can and should be giving you support and encouragement to level up on professional certifications. However, budget shouldn't really be much of an issue anymore either, because although there are formal training programs that would certainly give you a 4-figure price tag to get that training and certification, there's also a ton of free and almost free resources to get similar kinds of training. It's also quite common that we find, as technologists are increasingly in these client-facing roles, to find that people have home office labs where they're getting like hand-me-down equipment from their employers, and they're using that to continue their training and certification. If you're struggling to find time to get through this kind of stuff, it could be as simple. Yes, there's a lot of formal training programs that are relatively inexpensive, like the Google Career Certificates, Amazon, NVIDIA. They all have free and inexpensive kinds of resources. Of course, there's always YouTube videos, LinkedIn Learning, Udemy, simply listening to podcasts, attending webinars. There's a lot of different ways to get this kind of training beyond formal training. But the most important thing is to have this mindset of continuous improvement and trying to level up to the point that you're really comfortable having reasonably technical conversations with your ideal clients. And in the short term, if there's a knowledge gap that you're not able to bridge fast enough, then the next best thing is to bring in other subject matter experts from your team, like system engineers, solutions engineers, sales engineers that you work with, product managers that you work with. And in that particular case, like when you're hosting educational events or hosting webinars or hosting breakfast seminars or hosting lunch and learns, you're exactly that. You're the host, you're the moderator, you're the concierge, and you're bringing together all these great subject matter experts from your own company. If you get to the point that you've exhausted all of your internal subject matter experts, or you're getting a lot of pushback, you of course can bring in guest resources from outside of your company. If you're part of channel partner programs, a lot of channel partner programs include exactly that. They include being able to borrow access to their internal subject matter experts to come in to on unqualified opportunities and to speak at webinars and speak at other events. And of course, there's contractors. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. But if you're want to be able to generate more of these qualified opportunities, I would encourage you to position yourself more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, eventually maybe even a thought leader. And in the short term, from a practical standpoint, what this usually looks like is hosting really incredibly impactful webinars for the very specific kinds of people on very specific kinds of topics. Remember, you did your homework, right? They told you their 10 or 12 biggest goals and challenges that they're trying to figure out. You got 10 or 12 months, right? One a month over the next 10 or 12 months. That's your events calendar. That's what you want to cover in your webinar series. If you have a lot of prospects and clients that can get to your office within a 30 or 60-minute ride, and you have a nice classroom or conference room, take the exact same content that you would talk about in that 10 or 12 part webinar series and run it as a breakfast seminar or run it as a lunch and learn. And again, you don't have to build all the slides yourself. You don't have to build all the curriculum yourself. That's a very, very full-time job. But what you really do need is you need buy-in a lot of times from your executive team that the future of your company largely revolves around demonstrating to the marketplace that you have some of the smartest people on the planet in your particular geographic region for these company sizes, for this particular job function, for specific kinds of industries. And you want to make sure that that's not the best kept secret, because in order for you to educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, they have to want to spend time with you. If you're chasing them all the time, this doesn't work. And when we create this environment where every month we're having these fantastic learning and development, professional development experiences that rival the kind of content that they thought they'd have to fly across the country or fly up across the planet to be able to attend, and you're bringing this directly to them. You do not need large numbers of people attending your webinars or attending your small events, your in your conference room, your training room, to really, really move the needle. Like, you could have 20 people in the room and 90% of them are from your target accounts, 3 or 4 people from one account, 2 or 3 people from another account. And those clusters and could represent both opportunities. The goal really is to educate, build trust, and inspire by sharing unique insights that can help them do the job better. And to the extent that you can do that well, generating qualified opportunities becomes very straightforward. To the extent that you're still trying to market and sell like you did 10 or 20 years ago, well, it can be a very, very uphill battle because buyer preferences have changed so much. We are for sure in this world now where the self-driven buyer's journey, where nearly all of the research and decision-making happens without you in the room, is a really, really big barrier for a lot of companies that are stuck on a very traditional sales and marketing playbook. But now that you know the answer to this question, you don't need to fall into that trap. You don't need to live in the past, because with like 95% certainty, your target, your prioritized buyer personas, and your ideal client profiles have become more and more sales allergic. They just don't want to spend a lot of time with sales teams anymore, but they still need to learn how to do their job better. They're still investing in professional development. And to the extent that you can curate these amazingly helpful educational experiences and you show up with titles and topics and value that's irresistible to them, they will register and they will attend. And when they see this hyper relevance, this hyper specificity being irresistible, they're also a lot more likely after they register to say, when it comes to cybersecurity best practices for the data storage needs of mid-market manufacturers, we know it takes a village. It's typically people involved from operations, infrastructure, compliance, finance, cybersecurity, procurement. So with that in mind, who else from your team, who else from your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button on your email and let them know why this matters. And that simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years, one, it's shocking how few of your competitors are doing it when it's so ridiculously easy to set up. This is like something that you set up in 15 or 20 minutes every time you do an event. And that's the secret to getting more clusters of people from the same company, essentially getting to meet the decision committee as part of your education and trust building. And teams that attend together, teams that learn together, tend to grow together. You're proactively driving alignment in those formative stages of the buyer's journey. And again, when you do this repeatedly, by the time it's part 2, part 3, part 4, what you start to notice is the people that attended learn so much that they're even more receptive the next time to bring even more of their coworkers. And sometimes you do this so well where they kind of pull you aside and say, hey, there's like 4 or 5 of us from our team. We're having our all hands meeting next Friday. Why don't you just come in and present to the whole team? Like, that would be awesome. And this is how you know that you're really turning the corner and getting out of the vendor box, staying out of the vendor box, and being seen more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, and a subject matter expert. That's really what the future of marketing and sales and account management is going to look like throughout the data center industry, as being a fantastic project manager, a fantastic quarterback, a fantastic coordinator that helps your internal champion build consensus across their team and throughout multiple teams within the company. And in order to empower those team members, in order to empower your internal champions, it starts with education, trust, and thought leadership. So those are some of the key considerations to think about as you are building your lead generation, as you're building your lead nurturing, as you're building your opportunity generation, as you're building your sales and go-to-market strategy for how a data storage, data management, and cloud services company can generate more qualified opportunities. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. Okay, what is up next? What's our next question? How does a modular data center developer generate leads? How does a modular data center developer generate leads? That is a terrific question. Just to make sure we're on the same page, if you're relatively new to the data center ecosystem, modular data centers are data centers that are self-contained and delivered in a container that looks like the size of like an RV, like a recreational vehicle, or like a trailer that goes on the back of an 18-wheeler, or like a railroad car. And some of them are a little bigger, some of them are a little smaller. But the distinguishing part of a modular data center is that it's delivered with its own four walls, meaning that it can be manufactured in a factory and shipped to wherever it needs to be within a couple of days, or it depends on how close by it is. If your modular data center factory is across town from where it's going, once it clears QA and it's ready to ship, it's literally going on a truck and it can be delivered however long it takes the truck. But if you're shipping these across the country, if you're shipping these by sea, if you're shipping these by rail, it's basically the transport time. So why people love modular data centers is they're incredibly fast to deliver. They're incredibly flexible. And for lead time, you can't beat it. That's why for special events, that's why for disaster recovery purposes, it's amazing. Even over the years, I've seen people set up modular data centers in traditional wholesale data center data halls. Again, because it kind of gives each tenant, it gives each person that's leasing that module the feeling of having their own self-contained suite. Now, in the world we live in now, as power has become incredibly scarce, utility grid power has become incredibly scarce. The great part with modular data centers is where you have power, but it could take you anywhere from 18 to 36 months to do all your site work and land preparation and construction and commissioning and everything. You can take that 18 to 36 months down to a couple of weeks from the time you order, or a couple of months from the time you order, to when you have your modular data center delivered. So there's a huge benefit in moving much faster, moving much more aggressively. I was even on a panel discussion a couple of months ago, and we were talking about this emerging trend. It's with property tech owners, with real estate investors and folks that are in the data center real estate. They're talking about how hotel owners are thinking about having modular data centers in their parking lots to turn extra space into something that has, it takes up probably about as much space as, 5 or 6 parking spaces in a parking garage or parking lot, in a surface parking lot. And you think about the difference in revenue from renting out those 5 or 6 parking spaces compared to having a modular data center in place. Like, you talk about best use of land. So yeah, that's an interesting use case. What's come up recently as well is there are companies doing modular construction that helps to solve other power and cooling related needs in the data center ecosystem. For example, on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that I host, I interviewed the founder of a company called ECL a little while back, Yuval Bakar, and he was talking about how they're using modular construction to be able to more rapidly deploy data center modules that are run on hydrogen fuel cells. Because when you talk about using an alternate form of energy as opposed to traditional grid power backed up by traditional diesel generators, the entire design of the data center needs to change. It's not like you can just hook a traditional data center up to hydrogen fuel cells and do that efficiently. So when you talk about doing that, essentially the modules are being manufactured in a factory and shipped to be deployed. And if you need 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts or 50 megawatts or whatever the current capacity is, you just order more modules and they're integrated together on a common platform. So that's modular construction as opposed to traditional modular data centers. And aside from the fact that they both have the word modular in them, they're used for very, very different purposes. So this particular question is about the more traditional kind of modular data centers that have been around since the 2010s. And I walked through them the first time in 2016, but I know they were around for easily 2, 3, 4 years before that. And they don't show any signs of slowing down. They're a big hit. Modular data centers work really well for edge applications as well, because they can be manufactured and shipped really quickly to a very precise location where there's power. We know that the limiting factor right now with most data center development is power. So for a modular data center developer to generate leads, what essentially, for most modular data center developers, the first thing is, can you ship globally, or are you limited to shipping in a particular region of the world, in a particular continent or a particular country? That's a big deal, knowing that geographic part of your ideal client profile, because doing lead generation in your own country versus a couple of groups of country is very, very different than potentially doing lead generation globally. If you're doing lead generation globally, not only do you have to worry about localization issues, you have to worry about the differences in preferences among different kinds of segments within your ICP, within your ideal client profile, and certainly different kind of preferences among the different kinds of stakeholders, the different kinds of personas. I'll give you a perfect, for instance, a little bit outside the modular data center developer world. If you think about I had someone on the podcast from Legrand, actually 2 people from Legrand in South America, one from a marketer from Colombia and a sales leader from Chile. And we talked about how it's not just a matter of localizing the marketing collateral and localizing the sales scripts and localizing the Canva templates. It's a matter that in different countries and different regions of the world, the whole messaging and the value proposition is quite different. So it's not just a matter when you're generating leads, it's a matter of figuring out where that beachhead is, where your home base is, how comfortable you feel saturating that area. For a relatively small data center developer that's below, say, 10 million in annual revenue, 20 million in annual revenue, 50 million in annual revenue, a couple dozen employees. If you are currently at that size where you feel like you're already pretty stretched thin and you just have a single sales team and you may not even have a single full-time marketer, you definitely for sure are not in a position where you should be thinking about multinational, multilingual, multicultural, because it's not just a matter of translating, it's localization. And it's not just a matter of localizing the website and localizing the social posts and localizing the email, it's having local support there. Can you get your modular data centers through customs? Speaking of the podcast, I had someone on a little while ago too, whose entire business is being importer of record, IOR, for data center related businesses. When you ship these data centers into a foreign country, are they going to get tied up in customs, or are they actually able to be delivered? These are all major, major considerations for where to do lead generation. So we're going to keep it super simple. You're doing lead generation in the same country where you're currently manufacturing your modular data centers. And for that particular use case, essentially what we're trying to do is to figure out your ideal client profile. We're trying to figure out how big or small these companies are. So where we're located, the geographic part of your ideal client profile, we're going to say at this point is pretty set in stone. We're going to keep it really simple. You're marketing and selling and servicing and delivering these modular data centers in the same country where your company is headquartered and where you're currently manufacturing these modular data centers. After that, then we need to figure out how big or small your ideal clients are. In other words, your price point, right? Your entry level offering. How big realistically does a data center operator or an enterprise that's buying your modular data center need to be to afford your entry level offering? Are you priced to compete at the low end of the market, or you can sell to any company that's got revenue and cash flow to be able to afford what you're doing? In other words, they could be a 10-person or 30-person co-location operator and they're a fit for you. Or is your entry-level price point such that it's very far-fetched that a company that's doing less than 50 million of revenue, that has less than 100 employees or 200 employees, would be a fit for what you're offering? That you need to know. So those are typically considerations that come up at the intersection of like your product manager and your chief engineer, your technical co-founder, whoever is involved in the roadmap decisions of what specs are going into building your modular data centers, what kinds of cost structure comes into play. Your CFO certainly would be involved in that conversation, and how that equates to the minimum client size, the minimum number of employees, minimum turnover annual revenue that a data center operator or a enterprise would need to have to be able to afford your least expensive modular data center. At the extreme upper end of the range, is there a finite size at which an enterprise client can be so large and so demanding that what they want from you in terms of carrying a receivable for months, insurance regulations, compliance regulations, integration regulations, whatever it is, are just a huge burden right now, and that your current team's capabilities would be stretched too thin? You'd have revenue concentration, a host of issues that you won't want to get into right now. And you may come to the conclusion that when it comes to your lead generation and your ideal client profile, you have like this Goldilocks scenario: not too hot, not too cold with the porridge, right? So not too big, not too small. So on the not too small, maybe for argument's sake, you say, okay, a company needs to have at least 50 employees, be like at least a $10 million a year company or your local currency equivalent. And at the upper end of the range, 5,000 employees. Beyond like 5,000 employees, a big enterprise, we're just not able to do it today. And that's still 50 employees to 5,000 employees should give you plenty of addressable market, plenty of ideal client profile opportunities where you're located. There may also be some industries that are a better fit for you than others, but at least that gets you to the point now where you can start building out that target account list. You can deciding how you're going to assign those target accounts to different members of your sales teams. And then within those target accounts, figure out who are the most likely buyers, who are the most likely stakeholders that you're going to be interfacing with in these companies. Are they directors of data? Are they executives in charge of data center development? Are they data center construction folks that reluctantly get pulled into working on modular data centers? Are they IT executives? Are they logistics and supply chain folks? And small companies, like a small co-location operator with 50 employees or 100 employees, you're probably dealing directly with the CEO or CTO or COO or CFO or someone like that, certainly at that size. So your company size and their company size a lot of times dictates how granular your segmentation strategy needs to be, how many different buyer personas that you're potentially supporting with your lead generation needs. But once you have that figured out, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to look at is for your first most important kind of stakeholder, your primary, your second most important kind of stakeholder, your secondary buyer persona. Again, these are the people that typically show up on the decision committee. Look at your 10 most recent deals or your 10 biggest deals that you've closed, and look in your CRM and see who is in on a lot of these meetings. That should give you a pretty big idea as to who we want to clone, who we want to focus on getting more of going forward. And then for those stakeholders, we want to look at 10 or 20 representative people in each of those segments and figure out what the consensus is for their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, especially the goals that are at the intersection of IT infrastructure, that are leading indicators that they're going to be in market for a modular data center in the coming weeks and in the coming months. And what are the biggest frustrations that they run into when it comes to looking at modular data center providers? What are their biggest struggles and challenges? To the extent that you have the consensus on their goals and challenges, that essentially should feed everything that you're looking to do with your lead generation strategy. Your lead magnets, your webinars, your in-person events, your awareness, your consideration, your decision stage, lead generation offers, how you nurture your leads, how you deal with email marketing, what you do with your digital ad strategy, what you do with social media. Know in their own words what they're trying to achieve professionally, individually, as a team, and as a company, and know what's driving them nuts, what their biggest struggles and challenges are. To the extent that you can infuse those 10 or 12 topics into everything that you're doing with your lead generation strategy, it will resonate a lot better with that segment. Don't try to use the same information, one size fits most or one size fits everyone. In today's hyper connected 24/7, 365 kind of world where people are just constantly doing research all the time, incredibly attention starved, it's so important to cut through the noise by being super specific. And the way you be super specific is picking your battles, knowing who that primary is, knowing who the secondary is, and most of all, being super client-centric, knowing what's going on in their world and adjusting all of your lead generation, all of your nurturing, all your education and trust building to be focused on what they need to do for their jobs, what they need to do for their teams, what they need to do for their companies, and what is driving them nuts. The better job you can do with being a resource person, a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, maybe even a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modular data centers and at the intersection of their big goals and their big challenges, the more they're going to want to spend time with you. And that's the key unlock with all of this for lead generation and opportunity generation, is creating an environment where like you're aiming for essentially providing professional development and learning and development for your ideal clients, for these prioritized buyer personas, that motivates them to want to spend a significant amount of time with your client-facing team members that are expert enough about what they're trying to achieve in their job that they see a lot of value from learning from their peers. That's the key unlock with all of this to get you out of the vendor box and to keep you out of the vendor box, is using learning and development, using professional development as a way to get back into these early and middle stage conversations that for the most part, and the self-driven journey that we're in right now, you're basically locked out of. Gartner found 83% of a typical journey is over before vendor contact, before they're willing to speak with someone with you. Can you really survive? Can your sales team really be effective if they're only in there for the last 17% of their journey? Can you really be an effective football, baseball team, tennis match, whatever, if you're locked out of the game for all but the last 17% of the game? Probably not, right? So we need to figure out how to get you in early and often. Early as possible, as often as possible. Think about 25 to 30 different touch points that they're going to go through between complete stranger and purchase decision. What do we do to saturate the surface area? This is where conferences are not getting it done, because conferences give you a touch point or two, and it can be a crazy expensive touch point or two. But after that conference, there's 362 days of the year where on any given day, they may decide, oh, today's the day I got to work on figuring out our modular data center development strategy. And you may like it to be the day or the week immediately following the conference, but it may be 17 days later, and then 94 days later, and then 131 days later. And if you don't have systems and process and a motivation to keep going back early and often in a way that's not perceived as a pest, but is seen as a helpful educator, as seen as a helpful subject matter expert, as seen as a helpful consultant who's helping them solve a legit business problem, it's very, very easy for you to lose momentum to a competitor that's more tuned into the self-driven buyer's journey. So that's the key with all of this, is understanding that we don't have anywhere near the leverage that we did 10 years ago. People are more sales allergic than ever, and we need to figure out a way to earn our way early and often. And the way we earn our way in early and often and get invited onto their side of the table, and this is incredibly important for lead generation and lead nurturing and opportunity generation, is they have to see us as more like experts and trusted advisors and teachers and consultants, and a lot less like a vendor salesperson, a vendor account executive or sales development rep that works for a modular data center developer. So lead with education. Use that as a very powerful way to build trust. Bring your best internal subject matter experts with you and be super focused on who they are and what is going on in their world. Not what you would like to be going on in their world, but what's actually going on in the world. Those are all the key considerations that I would be thinking about as a modular data center developer that wants to dramatically improve its lead generation. Do you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A? If so, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. Okay, what is up next? What's our next question that we're going to address this week? We are now going to exit the zone of data center operator, data center provider, and we're going to enter into the world of data center technology, data center technology providers. So this particular question is all about telecommunications and networking services. How does a data center telecommunications and networking services company find good salespeople? Ooh, that's a great one. We're talking about talent acquisition on the sales side for sales development and account executives and account managers. How does a data center telecommunications and networking services company find good salespeople? That is a fantastic question. And it's one in which your sales leadership, your team members, your sales directors, your VPs of sales probably spend a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how to make that a reality. So here's how I would approach this. For starters, most companies that are telecommunications carriers don't describe themselves as being principally in the business of data center telecommunications, usually because telecommunications is just one particular segment. Data center is just one particular segment for a telecommunications company. Usually telecommunications companies are also providing fiber and potentially 5G and other kinds of services through a piece of fiber going into a company, or in some cases a residential application. In some cases they're working with towers, like mobile cell towers. But yeah, typically in the same way that banks and government organizations use the term small business, but small business owners never use the term small business to describe themselves. I don't know a lot of telecommunications carriers that describe themselves as data center telecommunications carriers, unless their offering is really hyper specific to just data centers, and I've chosen to really eliminate all the other kind of lines of business. And even among telecommunications professionals, I see very often that there's a distinct line between data focused and voice focused data center professionals. Like, for example, I get lots of LinkedIn invitations, and I'm always growing my LinkedIn network. And I see among a lot of data center related companies, they specialize in like unified communications, UCaaS. That's voice, like voice over IP. And that's a completely different career path in a lot of companies than specializing in data. So there's even that dividing line. So yeah, a company that's into data center telecommunications is focusing obviously on the data side as opposed to the voice side. And they're also providing networking services, either within the data center and outside of the data center, between data center locations. So the key thing is, how are they going to find good salespeople? Typically, when it comes to finding the best salespeople, there's a couple of tried and true ways. For starters, I should point out that there's a lot of data center recruiters globally. That category seems to have really mushroomed in the last couple of years, which is really curious because most data center recruiters that are self-aware realize that platforms like LinkedIn and OpenAI and Indeed are investing a ton into AI that could potentially really upend their career trajectory by making it way, way easier for hiring managers to self-serve. But that aside, what's interesting is there actually are telecommunications sales related recruiters that I come across from time to time, because it is a different kind of career path. You really, in order for you to have a degree of success. Now, I've seen people that have gone back and forth between telecommunications and co-location and the other direction as well. And there is generally a learning curve, but I've found that most people that describe that learning curve, usually within 3 to 6 months, they get up to speed, mostly because they're selling to a common kind of client with just a different kind of service, different kind of IT service. So like, there's telecommunications circuits, and those telecommunications circuits come into the data center through a meet-me room where they're all aggregated together in regions. So there's multiple competitive offerings in that meet-me room from multiple carriers. That carrier choice, that carrier neutrality is what makes the data center even more appealing to their clients, because the more choice there is, the more competition there is, the better it is for them. Better price, better by the less choice, the less options they have, the less competitive the offerings are going to be, the more expensive they're going to be, and that carrier doesn't have a lot of incentive to continue upgrading what they're providing. So that's a big issue in regions that want to grow, in particular like metro areas. A lot of times there's these IXs, internet exchanges, that are designed to promote growth in that particular region by bringing more carriers into that region, and then presumably to have those carrier circuits of fiber lines distributed into the data centers, both enterprise data centers and data center operators, where Meet Me Room is going to be a thing. Now, do telecommunications carriers typically provide networking services? Yeah. They're usually focusing on the networking services between data centers as opposed to within data centers. Within the data center itself is usually the domain of the colocation operator. And a lot of colocation operators that get really good with that get up into the realm of really providing like managed IT services, or some cases they'll bring in managed service providers as a supplement to that, or give their clients choice. But typically the networking that happens within the data center usually is within the scope of what a colocation operator would do, that's rubbing up against the boundaries of being like in the managed services, IT services business. And then the telecommunications carriers usually from the Meet Me Room outward into the rest of the world, so the networking between locations. So finding good salespeople that understand that ecosystem, a lot just tend to poach each other. Really. I actually anecdotally very strongly believe that 10% of the people that go to conferences are going to conferences on their employer's dime because they don't like where they're working very much and they're hoping to network their way into a better job. So if you're a CFO or a board member and your executives keep coming to you and ask you to approve another couple $100,000 or a couple of million in conference investment for next year, just to understand that, again, I'd be talking off the top of my head here, but just anecdotally with what I see going on at the conferences, you see an awful lot of people that change companies in the days or the weeks immediately following a major conference. Is it just coincidental, or did they go to that conference? So the question is, did the disillusioned employee go there looking for an opportunity, or they were happy and someone came over to the booth in a networking event and was trying to poach them away from their current employer? Probably a little bit of both, but just understand that that's part of the data center. That's part of the technology conference ecosystem, is that stuff is literally going on. And at the risk of getting into beyond PG-13 comments, I don't usually like to create a lot of non-evergreen content, but a couple months back in the United States, there was a moment that happened at a music concert from the band Coldplay, pop band that's been around for decades. They were hosting a concert in the Boston, Massachusetts area, I think in the same stadium where the New England Patriots play. And a couple that wasn't supposed to be a couple, having like a extramarital date, got caught on camera, and they turned away from each other when the kiss cam came up to them. This ended up being a viral moment. So is there a certain amount of Coldplay type of activity going on at conferences? Again, there's a lot of good and bad parts with that ecosystem, but okay, when it comes to finding good salespeople, there's people that are poaching from each other. I think where there's a really big opportunity, as well as there's a lot of complementary skill sets in different parts of the ecosystem that can be repurposed into telecommunications carrier sales. So in other words, someone that is working in sales for a managed service provider that's selling to small and medium-sized businesses. It's a very similar kind of skill set of someone that can be successful as an account executive or sales development rep in telecommunications sales. So IT services, managed services kinds of companies, co-location companies, we talked about that a few moments ago. And then other parts of the data center technology ecosystem as well. Like, for example, a lot of sales for telecommunications, at like a broad level, we talked about the split on telecommunication sales between data and voice. Within those splits, there's also usually a direct and an indirect muscle. What does the direct mean? Well, the direct means you're selling directly to end users who are signing up for their own telecommunications account, their own telecommunications circuits. Indirect means you're selling through channel partners. So these are managed service providers, network integrators, value-added resellers, master agents who have their own book of business, their own client relationships, and they're essentially acting as an extension of your sales and services teams with their own clients. Again, very different muscles. In a tiny company, is it possible you could bounce back and forth between these 3 or 4 different contexts? Possibly, but for any telecommunications carrier that has any kind of scale, let's beyond a few dozen employees, you will almost certainly have people specializing in data and voice separately. You'll have people specializing in direct and indirect, especially. You'll have people specializing in different company sizes, like selling to small, medium-sized business versus selling to mid-market versus selling to enterprise. You'll have people specializing in specific verticals, like telecommunications carriers having a team or an account executive at the absolute minimum who just specializes in healthcare or manufacturing, or data center service providers like colocation and hyperscale providers, or schools or education, what have you. So there's a lot of different specializations, but I think in terms of finding good salespeople, some of it is coming from referrals from your internal team members. Some of it is coming from using external recruiters. Some of it is coming from looking at adjacent industries where people aren't happy with a comp plan. They're not happy with their boss. I know a lot of people leave jobs because their boss is not doing it for them. And there's a lot of people that end up moving because maybe they had a remote job in the past and the management team is insisting that everyone return to office. And for whatever reason, it's not practical for them to return to office, either because the office is a 6-hour car ride away and it's not really something they can commute daily, or maybe because they have a family, either childcare, elder care, whatever, or it's just not possible for them to go from remote to hybrid to being in office. So that can cause people to change jobs. In some cases, there's mergers or acquisitions where an entire team is deemed to be redundant. In some cases, they're working for a company where their division is sold off and then shut down and sunsetted. There's a lot of reasons why people, while talent is constantly in flux, but for sales managers, sales directors, VPs of sales, chief revenue officers, there's a significant amount of time that you're spending on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis on recruiting. Because recruiting and onboarding and getting people to ramp and productive and everything, your numbers and your comp plan depends on others hitting their numbers and their comp plan. And we know with long sales cycles and we know with ramp time, like if you needed a salesperson to be performing this month, you probably needed to hire that person 3 to 6 months ago. And you probably needed to be recruiting for that position 6 to 9 months ago. So there's lead time on all of this. I think playing the long game is incredibly important. I also think going forward, what's come up in a lot of conversations recently when I've talked with recruiters, and I've had some great recruiters on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, is how a lot of candidates are now navigating their search for new employers in the same kind of self-service fashion that their buyers are looking for IT services. In other words, like your social media, your videos, your podcasts, your webinars, your website are an enormous magnet to pull in the right people. And if some or all of those assets suck, you're kind of doing the opposite. You're repulsing away some of the best and brightest. So don't overlook the fact that employer marketing, a potential candidate being able to hear from others that are working in a sales capacity for that particular company, how amazingly impactful that could be. And the more closely tied, the more closely that person's job title and demographics match up to the potential candidate, the more impactful that could potentially be. So it's beyond just job fairs. This is like the virtual version of a 7x24 by 365 job fair that never shuts down. So yeah, I'm a big believer in content and employer marketing as well, and sharing success stories, and reviews can make a big impact as well. Glassdoor has been around for 10 years. HireVue helps people understand, like for a company they're joining, what percentage of the sales team is exceeding quota, what the average retention is. Like if your sales team's a revolving door, that's usually red flag city, that no one's meeting quota or no one's happy working there. So all of those are considerations for leveling up and finding good salespeople. But at the end of the day, your existing employees are usually going to be the most effective way to attract and retain the best and brightest. If your existing employees love working there, and you have had people that have been consistently hitting President's Club for several years in a row, and they love their sales managers, if they love their sales directors, if they love their VPs of sales, and they love the culture and everything, that's a very, very powerful magnet to attract more people like that. If the opposite is happening, it's the opposite of a magnet. It's like polar magnets that are pushing people away. So at the end of the day, this is really tightly joined with culture. And then I see a lot of people too that have entered and left various parts of the tech ecosystem as well with perceived growth opportunities in a particular part. So if the part of data center telecommunications that you're working on you perceive as really healthy, as a really big growth opportunity, that's fantastic. But just recognize that the self-driven buyer's journey is a really, really big deal. A lot of buyers now are preferring to do a ton of research before they're ready for a sales interaction. So to the extent that you're going to get in early and often, they really need to see you a lot more like an expert and a lot like a traditional sales professional. If you can do that, fantastic. If you're struggling with that, then a marketplace may be coming to potentially eat your lunch. Early on in the life of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I hosted an interview with Ben Edmond, who's the founder and CEO of ConnectBase. If you're working in telecommunications sales and you haven't come across ConnectBase, it's an online marketplace that dramatically simplifies the process of provisioning telecommunications services. It's definitely something that you need to know about, because your company is likely either working with it or you're going to be facing competition going head to head with it. But a lot of the way the world is moving to, at least on very mature product categories, is trying to make it as easy as possible for people to navigate self-driven journeys. So in a world where you're fighting extra hard to be able to break through that noise, being seen as the teacher, the consultant, the subject matter expert, the trusted advisor, even the thought leader, is incredibly impactful. That's why we see so much specialization among sales roles by not only geographically, but company size and even by vertical. It makes an enormous, enormous difference for cutting through the noise. So when it comes to that telecommunications, that data center telecommunications company, a networking service company that wants to find good salespeople, make sure you start looking inward first. Make sure you got your house in order, and then having that house in order internally set you up in the best place to be able to attract and recruit and retain the best kind of good salespeople that you're looking for going forward. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center telecommunications, a networking services company can find good salespeople. That was the end of the third question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back in the second part of this week's show, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're tuned into the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. So what's up next? Oh, this is a really interesting one. This is a question that we don't get very often. It's from what we consider the 5th part of the data center ecosystem. So just to recap in terms of orientation of where we are, there's data center operators, which are like hyperscale and co-location and edge providers. Sometimes modular and data center providers fit into that data center operator-ish kind of segment. There's data center technology related companies, data center facilities related companies. We place data center construction, real estate and investment in the same part of the ecosystem. And then the 5th part of the data center ecosystem, we consider outsourced sales and marketing. These are PR firms, these are marketing agencies, these are sales consultancies, brokers, manufacturers, reps, recruiters, events, and media companies. So super curious when we get questions every once in a while from this part of the data center ecosystem, because the companies are wired a little differently than the other 4 parts of data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. So this particular question is from a data center events business. How does a data center events company, events business generate customer awareness? How does a data center events business generate customer awareness? That is a terrific question. And it's one that I've worked on with multiple data center events companies over the years. The interesting part with owning a conference business, which is basically what this is in the data center ecosystem, to be in the events business. Yeah, a lot of events companies also do virtual events and summits and webinar series. And a lot will also do basically the modern version of custom publishing, downloadable reports, ebooks, premium content, lead magnets. They do sponsored social posts. They'll do email blasts. They'll do all of the above. But if a primary part of that company's revenue driver, a huge part of their annual revenue is coming from big regional, national, global conferences, generating customer awareness is a really, really big deal. So for most conference businesses, they're getting their revenue from usually 3 different places. One kind of revenue is paid registrations. And increasingly, as data center events companies, data center conference businesses have tried to better segment the market, it's very common that even among their paid registrations, that there's a version of like multivariable calculus going on. So on one vector, you have lead time to the event, with the cost significantly escalating as you get closer and closer to the event, and the lowest price being committing to going to the event, buying your ticket several months in advance. So it's very, very common to have like super early bird price, regular price, and then they don't call it late price, but it's like the last minute kind of price. So there's like 3 or 4 different levels of duration-based pricing or lead time-based pricing that depends how early you buy your ticket. And again, we're not talking about physical tickets anymore. In 99% of the cases, you're buying on a shopping cart on their site. Really small conference companies may outsource to something like Eventbrite, but most usually build their own platform and customize it so they can get exactly what they want and own all of the data and own all of the experience, all the events experience. So there's registration revenue, which is tied to a lot of times how early on someone buys their ticket. Then there's typically 3 or 4 different categories of tickets. Some events companies have a free category. What that's usually all about is they think they will have a difficult time getting the perfect audience that their exhibitors and their sponsors and their speakers essentially are paying to get access to. So they make that more straightforward by making that preferred category of registrant totally, completely free. This is the conference version of what's been around in trade publications for decades. Trade publications going back truly, I started seeing this in the 1990s. They had this concept called controlled circulation. What this meant is that most people that were subscribing to that publication, if they filled out a long, detailed application, essentially, or qualification questionnaire once a year, it could take them 10 or 20 minutes to figure that out. Essentially, they were getting a free, in most cases, weekly, or in some cases, monthly subscription to that publication that ordinarily at the time may have been like a $200 a year subscription. And the reason that those publishers were doing that is they were choosing to make all of their revenue coming from ad sales and none of their revenue coming, or very little of their revenue coming from subscriptions. So in the data center conference ecosystem, there's at least one huge one and a couple smaller data center events businesses who for sure use this model. So of their 3 or 4 different kinds of tiered pricing, they've decided like that IT professionals and facilities professionals that work for either an enterprise or work for a data center operator, they get to come totally, completely for free. Essentially, they're the product. They're attracting them, they're getting them to register, they're promising them free event, free meals. And in return for that, that attention is essentially being sold to the exhibitors, the sponsors, and to a lesser degree to the speakers. So that's the free category of ticket. The next category up usually is, okay, we want these people here in large numbers, but they're not so desirable that we're going to give them a free ticket. So for a lot of the data center events business, This would be people more on the service provider side that work in IT and facilities. So these could be like consultancies, management firms, integrators, solution providers, but it's not the sales and marketing folks. It's the IT and the facilities, the engineering kind of folks. The next category up from there, the most expensive or second most expensive ticket, is sales and marketing people that work throughout the ecosystem. They're there for very clear reasons. They might say they're there to learn, but at the end of the day, they're there to generate leads. They're there to do business. They're there to market their employer. They're paying a higher ticket. And then among the different categories of segmenting the price based on ideal client profile and based on essentially buyer persona, then there's also experience-based tickets where it's a 3-day conference, but there's a pre-day event that has 2 half-day professional development workshops. The VIP experience includes that pre-conference day, or the VIP experience includes reserved seating in the first 10 rows, includes backstage access, includes meet and greets with celebrity keynote speakers, includes a VIP luncheon. There's a lot of different things that come up, includes a golf tournament. There's a lot of different ways that data center events businesses are segmenting price based on how early you buy your ticket, your company's relationship within their ideal client profile, your relationship within their preferred buyer personas, and then the level of experience, the level of access that you're getting. And the level of access is probably most similar to what you might be used to in the hospitality or transportation industry, where airlines having first class, business class, premium economy, sitting with the cattle in the cargo compartment, and hotels too, like lower floor overlooking the garbage dumpster versus top floor penthouse overlooking the ocean, and then all the variations in between. So there's a lot of different ways that the data center events business has tried to segment to capture all of the preferences that people have. I remember back in college, they called this the capturing the consumer surplus, the excess value that someone is willing to pay above and beyond what you're currently charging them. So there's all of that going on. And I mean, again, going back to the basic question here is how does the events business generate customer awareness? So it depends on who they're trying to create customer awareness among. When we talked about a few moments ago that there's different categories of ticket prices depending on what your company does and what those individuals are, what that essentially means is just like any other part of the ecosystem, you have an ideal client profile and you have buyer personas. So depending on how that maps into your revenue structure and depending on how high of a priority it is for you to hit a certain revenue goal with a certain category of attendee, it's very, very common to find that at the absolute minimum, this has gotten so complicated that the person or the team that's in charge of driving paid registrations is very different than the person or the team that's responsible for selling exhibitors, that's just responsible for selling booth space, that's responsible for selling sponsorships. And the bigger your events business is, the more that's at stake, the more likely it is that, just like most parts of the data center ecosystem, you're specializing by price point. You're specializing by who you're selling into. In other words, like the person or the team that's in charge of selling 2,700 paid tickets for a 3,000 capacity event, those 2,700 paid tickets, that's like selling almost business to consumer. You're selling to individuals. Sure, nearly all of them work for companies, but you're selling more to that individual as opposed to a company. Now, there's things you can do too to tip the scales in your favor. Most events businesses at this point are willing to give a discount for 2 or more people, 3 or more people from the same company attending together. Sometimes that's rolled up into a sponsor exhibitor level because they want you to be to the point, well, if 3 of you are attending, you're only $2,000 away or $8,000 away or whatever from our least expensive booth part. So you may as well exhibitor agreement. So you may as well just do the exhibitor agreement, right? So there's a lot of interesting competing with yourself versus segmenting and differentiating among your different categories that come up as well. So again, the registration person is more almost like selling B2C. The person who's selling the team that's selling these smaller booths, Those are typically sold to startups, small businesses, a little bit into mid-market. And the huge booths, the ones that are multi-5-figure, some cases 6-figure commitments to the events business before you even get into all the other amenities that go into conference participation. Those are usually enterprise sales being typically sold to Fortune 1000 kinds of brands. Longer sales cycle, a lot more at stake, and the better job you can do with getting that anchor tenant nailed down, again, using the same kind of real estate analogy that's used throughout the ecosystem, the more everything else falls into place. So again, that's customer awareness and building different kinds of funnels. And it's very similar to how you'd sell throughout the data center ecosystem. You can have outbound, you can do email marketing, you can do paid ads, you can do social posts, you can do co-marketing. These very, very common in the data center events business to now have a dozen or more, potentially dozens of media sponsors. Essentially, those are quid pro quos where you're going to another publisher that's more complementary than competitive. You're saying, you mail your list, vice versa. We'll give you a solo email in return for you running a solo email for us. I also increasingly see some marketing agencies getting involved in that, where essentially they're doing the same thing. And if they do this enough time, they have a pretty big list of users that they can, I'm not going to use the 4-letter word, to send email that those users didn't necessarily want to get, but they're getting anyway. But at least in theory, if the list quality is pretty consistent, at least the audience is right. Did they ask to get those emails? There's a significant part of the data center events business that depends on these media partnerships as a way to shortcut the need to invest aggressively in their own customer acquisition and their own lead generation. And if you do this enough times, eventually your list of people that you send emails to may not get anywhere near the inbox, but you're sending to an awful lot of people, and enough of them, I guess, get to the inbox that it works over time, even if your open rates and deliverability rates and things like that suffer over time. So there's a number of different ways to generate customer awareness for registrations, for exhibitors, for sponsors. I would also argue that your speakers are another kind of customer. Why? If you don't have speakers, who's coming to the conference? Sure, there are speakerless events without speakers. They're like networking events, cocktail parties, but those are usually not national conferences. Those are usually standalone kind of events that are done either locally in a city or a regional area, or they're done as like a night before or a night of or something like that. Just simply because the revenue model isn't nearly the same as like renting a big hotel space or renting a big convention space. So yeah, getting your speakers is a part of customer awareness that I think a lot of people don't give enough credit to, because if your speakers aren't appealing and your topics aren't appealing, how are you getting people that register? And if you can't get registrants, what attention are you selling to these sponsors and the exhibitors? So it really, there's a holistic part of all this that comes together. So speaker awareness, speaker submissions. Now, can I say this without pissing off too many people? There's a significant part of the events business in the data center ecosystem where people are starting to legitimately question whether all of the people that are speaking on stage are there for editorial reasons or they paid to speak. And if they didn't pay directly to speak, are they paying indirectly because their company bought a big freaking booth, or they brought a lot of attendees with them, or this is year one and you're hoping to sell a big booth, a big sponsorship to them next year. Now, in the United States or in certain countries where there's a lot of consumer protections, if this was a B2C environment, you'd see things like much clearer disclosures required about whether there's really arm's length relationships between the speakers and the sponsors and the conference companies. But this is B2B, and a lot of environments, in most environments, it's not regulated. So who the heck really knows what's going on with all of the people that made it onto the speaker roster for various kinds of opportunities? We do know for sure that most events businesses in this space now sell sponsored speaking slots in addition to organically earned speaking slots. And there was a point in time back, I remember as recently as 10 years ago, where there was really strong separation between the editorial side of the conference and the commercial side of the conference. That, I think, left the building during the early 2020s when the conference industry took a real hit for a couple of years when no one was traveling. It wasn't safe to hold conferences, but now it's back with a passion. And yeah, this appears to be alive and well. So yeah, in terms of creating customer awareness, there's customer awareness for recruiting speakers to the extent that the speaker slots aren't being directly or indirectly sold. There's customer awareness for different categories of sponsors and exhibitors. There's customer awareness for different kinds of registrants. And there's even customer awareness that goes into recruiting media partners. Over time, your media partners will likely be pretty sticky from year to year. But over time, when you're a relatively new event, if you're choosing to get bartered email blasts going back and forth to two different lists and traded social posts and things like that to two different audience and segments, like that's a different kind of awareness. It's a different kind of channel. It's a different kind of ICP. It's a different kind of buyer persona. So those are all the different ways that data center events businesses can generate customer awareness. And I'd love to tell you that all of them love permission-based email, but some of them are more plugged into permission-based email than others. Somehow they manage to survive. Somehow the conferences and the events manage to survive. I do question, however, the long-term viability of events where essentially everyone needs to educate and build trust, and only 2 to 10% of the people that are there are able to educate and build trust. And I think right now we're seeing a dramatic amount of overinvestment in traditional paid events and severe underinvestment in a lot of companies' owned events. In other words, I get that there's a certain appeal of pressing the easy button and knowing that you're going to have presence at an event that has 500 people or 5,000 people. But if there's not a really good ICP match, if their demographics don't really match up with your ideal client profile really well, you may be looking for a big needle in a haystack. And that 500 number or that 5,000 number just ends up becoming a vanity metric if only 10% or 20% of the audience actually matches up with your ideal client profile. Conversely, I think there's a lot of people crapping on the value of small events that you run yourself in your own conference room, in your own classroom, on your own webinars, and your own rented space. The value of your own events is you get to decide exactly who you're going to invite. Your classroom holds 30 people, great. Invite 300 people on the hopes that 60 people register and 50% of those people attend your free event. And there's lots of different math on attendance rates, registration rates, and show rates on free events versus paid events. But the huge, huge advantage to your own events is you get to decide who gets invited. For most companies that have a good account-based marketing list, if you just started there, you're getting the right people from the right companies paying attention to you, not for 30 seconds as they wander by your booth, for 3 minutes as they wander by your booth on a really noisy conference floor, but for 45 minutes at a time, month after month, in a multi-part series. That's a lot of times what's necessary to move the needle. In a lot of contexts, one of the best things you can do if you're hell-bent on getting a booth is to use your booth as a lead generator for getting the right people in an education and trust building environment with a multi-part event series that takes place right after the event for exactly who they are and topics and concepts and goals and challenges that that are top of mind for that particular category. And again, you're setting up a really good environment for this if you're speaking from the stage, if you're educating and building trust, and the people from your team that are coming along with you can coast along on those fumes as well. The people that are buying booths at those conferences but not speaking, they're hoping to harvest the goodwill that the speakers create. And the people that are attending, that are sales and marketing folks and entrepreneurs that are looking to generate leads and book meetings at the events, but aren't buying booths and aren't speaking, well, they're looking to coast off the fumes of all the exhibitors. And I remember, I hate to keep going back to economics, but this whole idea of like the freeloader concept in the events industry, they call that phenomenon suitcasing. And some events companies have gotten pissed off about suitcasing enough with people coming to the events with pure intention of never going to the educational sense and purely walking from person to person, essentially carrying their booth in their suitcase or in their briefcase or on their tablet. This is why you've seen a hyper cynical industry get to the point that they're forbidding certain categories of people from attending. For other categories, you can attend, but you must be a sponsor. And this toxic environment has been brewing for the better part of 10 years. So again, this is part of what is customer awareness? Who's the demographics that we want there? Who's the demographics that we're explicitly excluding from able to attend the event? And if you want to avoid this whole kind of circus charged preferential kind of atmosphere, if you just focus on your own ideal client profile, if you focus on your own target account list and what those prioritized buyer personas care about, you'll get to the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, where they'll see you and your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with your category. The challenge is everyone is so ridiculously impatient and they're so obsessed on these vanity metrics that they never get a chance to even try to do this the right way. And then they wonder why it feels like they're spinning their wheels. And then they end up having to manufacture fake metrics from the attendees at your booth. I got a thanks for stopping by your booth email a couple months back from a conference in southern France and the Riviera and Cannes that I didn't attend. How did that happen? I think I know it happened. I'm a first degree connection of that person, and they probably imported their entire list because they're getting pressure from whoever to show that they had a lot of people visit their booth, and anyone that fits the persona, even if they weren't at that event. There's people too that as part of their sponsor, their exhibitor, they get access to the full attendee list. So they're mailing the entire attendee list when in reality, only 30% of the attendees visited their booth. Do those other 70% of the people really want to get your email inferring that they visited your booth when they didn't? That's a whole separate webinar. That's a whole separate Q&A. But those are some of the key considerations that I'd be thinking about from the standpoint of the speakers, from the standpoint of the exhibitors, from the standpoint of the attendees, and from the standpoint of the events business. Because at the end of the day, they are a business. It needs to be profitable. During the early 2020s, when the events business couldn't be at its fullest potential and was limited to just digital events, we know essentially what happened. And it's a healthy part of the ecosystem. Where I have issues is I don't think the events business should be defining the entire ecosystem. I think there's a lot more companies that should own their own events businesses, owned in the same way there's owned media versus earned media versus paid media. There's owned events versus earned events versus paid events. We're doing too much in the paid events. We need to get back to doing some owned media and some owned events if you really want to be able to own the narrative and truly differentiate your company for a self-driven world. So those are some of the considerations, both direct and indirect, and a little bit adjacent, that I'd be thinking about for how a data center events business can generate customer awareness. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. Okay, what is our next question? This is a good one because it straddles the line between data center operator and data center technology company. How does a hybrid cloud solutions provider improve its marketing and sales? How does a hybrid cloud solutions provider, CSP, improve its marketing and sales? So hybrid generally means that you're taking a mix of traditional co-location and some kind of cloud, and you're blending it together to have a custom solution that maps to what the client is looking for. That could be public cloud, it could be private cloud, it could be multi-cloud, but it's usually hybrid. Usually means that there's some degree of co-location involved to be able to make that work. And that usually it's a combination of governance where the data is physically living. It's sometimes latency issues. It's sometimes preference to where a particular strategic client is located, or all of the above. But at the end of the day, usually the hybrid cloud solutions provider is like a hybrid between a data center operator and an IT service provider, like a managed service provider. That's why so many managed service providers, MSPs, have morphed into cloud service providers or cloud solution providers over time, because they're essentially providing anything and everything having to do with IT that a small to mid-sized company wants from their outsourced IT partner that they can't currently provide in-house. The companies that really resonate with that CSP, MSP model tend to sell to smaller kinds of companies where IT is pretty strategic, but they're not big enough to have a really robust internal IT organization that can handle everything. So they tend to outsource a lot of different responsibilities to a single company who takes that single point of accountability by making everything working together, as opposed to outsourcing to a dozen different specialized firms that where there may be some accountability and finger pointing and blame gaming with each other. So that's a little bit about the business model. So for a hybrid cloud solution provider that wants to improve its marketing and sales, I think there needs to be some self-awareness as to where you've been most successful. Historically, going back 10 or 20 years, I mean, MSPs, value-added resellers, IT consultancies, integrators have been around a long time. I was in that fractional CTO kind of business in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and it wasn't quite called being an MSP back then. It was more known as being a technology consultant or integrator or value-added reseller. But that basic business model goes back even before I got into that space, going back to the 1980s and the emergence of the IBM PC industry and PC LANs, personal computers, local area networks, Novell NetWare, eventually Windows NT in the 90s, and eventually the early web client server kind of architecture. So with all of that in mind, yeah, there's companies that are very anchored to local communities, either because their clients want team that can get to their facility, whether they're offices, manufacturing, retail, home offices, or all of the above, that can get to their facility relatively quickly. And they also want team members that can get to the co-location facilities or where the IT assets are relatively quickly. And again, this is where, if they have that strong preference, they're more than likely going to favor a private cloud solution over a public cloud solution. Because the realities for a like IT service provider, like an MSP, they can go in, assuming that you give them authorization, they can go and take care of your IT needs in a co-location facility. But there's not going to be a welcome mat waiting for them at a Amazon Web Services data center, or a Microsoft Azure data center, or a Google Cloud data center, or an Oracle data center. If that permission is available at all, it's surely for the biggest of the largest enterprises. So there's that local bias, and even among, and again, with the local accounts versus regional accounts versus national kinds of clients, even the size of the co-location provider and the size of the managed service provider, how big their company is, how expansive their geographic coverage, is very telling a lot of times as to how big their clients can be. In other words, like a co-location operator that has 3 locations in a metro area or a single country or a single state can do reasonably well with companies that don't need to have international coverage, because they have coverage in a couple of different locations that usually, but at a certain point, larger clients, enterprise clients, want to deal with organizations that can cover, especially in this category, that can have coverage in all the regions where they do business and all the regions where they would potentially have infrastructure co-located. So there's definitely a relationship between your company size and their company size. Because being an IT service provider deals with data, it's also very, very common to find that there's certain industry categories that are either open to you or not open to you, depending on whether you have those accreditations and certifications, both at the facility level and techs that are trained to be able to operate in that kind of environment. So getting clarity on that, it's a long way of saying getting clarity on that ideal client profile is super important to improve your marketing and sales. I think too many people in small companies are trying to sell to everyone. And selling to everyone for a small company that's resource constrained is basically, in the world that we live in now, is like banging your head against the wall. The smaller your company's resources are, the smaller your sales and marketing team, the more I would be hyper vigilant about being super sharp, super focused on that ideal client profile. Get really clear on the geographic green lights and the geographic red lights. In other words, like, do they need to be local enough? Does their location need to be local enough that they can come into your facility, come into your office within a 30 or 60-minute drive? Or can they be anywhere in the world? Hybrid cloud solutions providers and data center operators quite often find that like 70 or 80% of their clients are server huggers, meaning they need to be able to come in and hug the server because they're a relatively close drive away. And then maybe 20% of their clients are long distance, meaning they're picking your location because they're not there in your local area. They may not even be on your continent, but they said, you know, we need a co-location facility in Phoenix, Arizona. or we need a co-location facility in Herndon, Virginia, or Seattle, Washington, or London, United Kingdom, or Singapore, wherever it is. But they're not anywhere near where you're located. Those are the long distance clients. So getting clear on that geographic split on where you've been most successful based on looking at your logos, your case studies, looking at your top 10 accounts, your top 100 accounts in your CRM is all super, super important for dialing in the geographic part of that ideal client profile. Size is also another really, really big deal. As I was alluding to a few moments ago, there are for sure cases where a hybrid cloud solution provider faces some pretty big red stop signs when it gets to trying to get into a certain account size. Does it happen at a small enterprise with 1,000 or 5,000 employees? Do you start hitting roadblocks at a 10,000 employee company, at a 50,000 employee company? Just recognize that if your company itself is not an enterprise and your company as a hybrid cloud solution provider has, say, 50 employees, you may have a very real glass ceiling that happens at about 1,000 employees, or maybe even as low as 500 employees, where you're a spectacular fit among small and medium-sized business and small and even perhaps all sizes of mid-market. But once you get beyond mid-market, it may be a real stretch for you to be successful in marketing, selling, and servicing those huge enterprise kind of accounts. Conversely, you also want to be realistic on the low end, how big they need to be to afford your minimums. And this is, again, in the same way where I said before that being greedy on your ICP and not being discriminating enough on who qualifies can also waste a lot of time. In terms of industries, I think size is another real amount of quicksand. I think for a lot of small companies, they're like, yay, revenue. But the problem is a 1 to 10 person startup has a lot of times IT needs that are way, way, way bigger than their budget. So the question is, how long can you afford to subsidize those really tiny clients that are way more demanding than their unit economics allows you to service profitably? Again, these are conversations that in a small company you're going to have with your CFO and your CEO and your CTO to try to figure out, like, okay, how big does the smallest client need to be? For a lot of companies in that category, you may decide, okay, they have to be at least 10 employees. They have to be $1 million in revenue or your local currency equivalent, or maybe they have to be 50 employees. Typically for CSPs, MSPs, they'll typically set the floor at about 10 employees or 25 employees or something like that, just because it's the unit economics have to be able to work. There's got to be enough lifetime value. The client acquisition costs can't be completely out of control. It can't take years for you to get payback on your client acquisition costs. You're not dealing with venture money. In most cases, you're talking about relatively closely held companies. So the profitability and the cash flow and everything has to work. Once you have figured out that low end, the bottom end of the range, and the upper end of the range, you're in good shape to talk about marketing and sales. If you don't have clarity on the geographic part, on the company size part, and on the industry part, you're not ready to talk about sales and marketing. And a lot of people in this business model, that hybrid colo cloud managed service provider, waste outrageous amounts of time and resources trying to chase a very loosely defined set of buyer personas, a very loosely defined ideal client profile. And one of the fastest ways for you to really turn things around is to draw some lines in the sand and say, hey, look, this is our ideal client profile. It's simple enough that it's on a single Google Doc. And this is our target account list. These are the couple hundred accounts, the couple thousand accounts that we're really going to focus on growing. And these are the prioritized buyer personas, and that's it. And if someone is from a company that's way bigger and way smaller, you can try to bring it to your boss as an exception, but we're not going to waste a lot of energy trying to build accounts that we either don't have the capability to service or are just too small to be able to service profitably. Once you do that, it becomes a lot easier to back into understanding who the prioritized buyer personas are. Usually for most kinds of businesses, when they've drawn the line in the sand, the first inclination that they're on the right track is that the prioritized buyer persona, if they're a CEO, is a pretty technical CEO of a pretty technical kind of business. If they're not a technical CEO of a technical kind of business, your primary better be a CTO or a VP of IT. Because trying to sell to the owner or CEO that's not technical themselves, that owns a non-technical business, is a recipe for unit economics disaster. You're going to spend a crazy amount of time educating someone that just may not be profitable for you to service for a really, really long time. And if you want to be a nonprofit, go volunteer for the Service Corps of Retired Executives or do something similar to mentor struggling small businesses. But if you need to build a profitable business as a colo operator, as an MSP, as a CSP, at some point there's got to be a line in the sand where the client is IT savvy enough, the CEO is IT savvy enough, the business model is IT dependent enough, and they have the capital to recognize and appreciate the true value of what you're providing. Because if their budget means that they probably should be buying self-serve prosumer tools, then you have to let them buy the self-serve prosumer tools. Maybe they should be buying Google Workspace or Office or 365 on their own, or buying Dropbox account on their own, as opposed to you trying to compete head to head with the extreme low entry level points of those kinds of offerings. Once you get clarity on that marketing and sales, what I would very heavily lean into is events. This doesn't mean setting up booths at local events. This means getting the smartest people in your company speaking at events where your ideal clients and your target buyer personas are already at in your local community. And even more important than that, hosting your own events in your own conference room, in your own classroom on a very regular basis. So once you have extreme clarity on your primary and your secondary buyer persona and their 5 or 10 biggest goals and their 5 or 10 biggest challenges, those are the 10 or 12 topics that I want you to cover once a month, every single month for the next 10 or 12 months. Maybe the first week of the month on Wednesday mornings, you're doing a breakfast seminar from 8:30 to 10 o'clock in the morning for your primary buyer persona. And the second Wednesday of the month, you're doing a lunch and learn from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. for your secondary buyer persona. And maybe on Thursday evenings after work, you're doing a monthly educational event for your tertiary buyer persona, which is a channel partner, other MSPs and other cloud service providers and other integrators. And again, the reason that I don't recommend lumping all of these together is, one, is you have pretty limited space if you're hosting these in your own facility. And second, when you get to being really client-centric, they're going to care about very different goals and very different challenges. The more you resonate with them, the more you cut through the noise. The less you resonate with them, the more they snooze and they ignore what you're doing, and they either register and don't show up, or they never register at all because the topic of the talk that you were talking about was totally not interesting to them in the first place. But yeah, the name of the game with all of the marketing and sales is inserting yourself into their learning and development, their professional development process. And the better you understand what's going on in their world, the more client-centric you are, the more likely it is that the topics of your event calendar once a month over the next 10 or 12 months will really resonate with them. For the people that register but aren't able to attend, or the people that should have attended but didn't, record those events. Make the recording available for people that want to share it with their colleagues and their boss that weren't able to attend. For the people that want to be able to attend your events live where they're not close enough to drive to your facility, run the same events as webinars. Again, same thing. Record for the other stakeholders that are from those companies that weren't able to attend, or the non-attendees, and send out the recordings, send out the slides. Again, it's about educating and building trust. And the better job we do with this, the more likely it is that they start to bring their coworkers with them. You start to meet the other members of the decision committee, you meet the boss, and over time it becomes super apparent to them why you're on the short list, why you stay on the short list. You get to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different options that are in front of them for hybrid cloud solutions. You'll start to neutralize and potentially knock competitive options off of the short list because they're spending so much time with you and learning so much from you that the education and trust building, the know, like, and trust is just off the charts. This is what marketing and sales needs to be looking like going forward in a world where people are so sales allergic now that nearly all of the research and decision making is happening without you in the room. The way you get back into the room is repositioning your account executives, your sales development reps, your marketers to look a lot more like teachers, consultants, trusted advisors, subject matter experts, maybe even thought leaders. And if those 3 categories of job functions in your own company can't pull it off themselves, then they for sure need support from your internal subject matter experts who can work with them to help present that highly valuable educational content. Your speakers can be your CEO, your COO, your CTO, your CIO. It can be your channel partners. It can be your NOC manager, whoever is knowledgeable on that particular topic that can put together a 30 or 45-minute talk on that particular topic and answer some questions. That's the name of the game. That's what I would focus on for a hybrid cloud solutions provider that wants to dramatically improve its marketing and sales effectiveness in the coming weeks, in the coming months, given the world that we now live in, where you're literally competing for attention against not only YouTube and LinkedIn and webinars, but you're competing for attention against people looking up the answers to questions they would normally have asked you, the human, with the chat apps. You're competing for attention against ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity and Claude. And when you realize that that's going on, we need to level up a couple notches with the value that we provide to our prospects and provide to our clients. That's how a hybrid cloud solutions provider can go about improving its marketing and sales. And that brings us to our final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's show so far, make sure to hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic, for a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. Okay, what is our final question? Question number 6. Oh, this is a great one because we haven't been in this part of the data center ecosystem at all in this show, in this episode. This one is facilities related. How does a data center engineering firm create long-lasting proof of concept with large corporations? How does a data center engineering firm create long-lasting proof of concept with large corporations? That is an excellent question. So again, with engineering, with your firm being made up entirely of engineers and providing this kind of services in the ecosystem, you're usually selling to other engineers and you're selling to facilities executives. In some cases, you could be working on the construction, the contractor side a little bit. You could be working with like commissioning, but we consider commissioning a huge part of the facilities part. We track about a dozen different facilities related business models in the data center ecosystem. So for a data center engineering firm, you're providing engineering services on an outsourced basis as a professional services firm, and you're looking to create long-lasting proof of concept with large corporations. Let's first put some guardrails on client size, because I think the nature of how you approach these proof of concepts depends to a great deal on how big your firm is and how big their firm is. Larger firms tend to have strong preferences to hire large firms. It makes them more comfortable. It makes their bosses more comfortable. It makes their boards more comfortable, that they feel that bigger is better and bigger is safer. Conversely, smaller companies a lot of times get pushed around by the big guys, and they tend to have preferences to work with more small to mid-sized firms. They like the idea of being able to have a direct line into the VP of engineering at your firm, or the CEO or the owner or the partner. And if they were engaging a multinational engineering firm with thousands of employees as a tiny company with a budget for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, they would never get anywhere near that level of leadership access in a large company. So I think the first thing we need to be really clear about is when it comes to selling to large corporations, if you're a tiny engineering firm, you are almost certainly going to get pushed around by large corporations. And I would love to tell you that we live in a utopian world where that doesn't exist, but it does. And that's the reason why a lot of times tiny, small engineering firms with a couple handfuls of employees are usually finding themselves more successful, happier, more profitable, whatever you want to call it, by working as subcontractors under larger firms that have the direct relationship with the clients. And I think over time, that's going to become an even bigger issue. Now, if you have a unique skill set that larger firms can't provide, if you have geographic coverage that larger firms can't provide, and this is something that's truly differentiated, truly unique, then yeah, there can be exceptions to this. But other things being equal, it's really tough as a tiny professional services firm to successfully sell to large corporations. Now, in terms of proof of concept, that is a product market fit issue, PMF, knowing exactly who your ideal clients are, the products and services they purchase from you, the price points, how long duration those relationships are, all the unit economics, sales cycle lengths, profitability. And the smaller your firm is, I think the more narrow of a menu you need and the more expansive your menu of services, the more important it is for you to have a larger company to be able to profitably and effectively market and sell those. So for long-lasting proof of concept with larger companies, what that's typically inferring is they want to make sure that the proof of concept projects are so well received that a significant percentage of those clients ultimately become clients, that they go from proof of concept to the full engagement, to the full project, and repeat projects over time. So I think part of that is a client selection battle of making sure that you are targeting the right clients in the first place, where you have not only the ability to sell the proof of concept, but you also have the ability to sell what comes next after the proof of concept. So again, that's a product roadmap, a services roadmap issue. That's product market fit, it's go-to-market fit. It's all of that wrapped in together. And where I've seen solo engineers have a difficult time is where they're trying to achieve that as a tiny firm, again, selling directly to huge firms, where you either do it their way or you don't work with them at all. And it's smaller companies that'll have more appreciation for your unique talents and what's special about your firm being that boutique engineering firm. So I think that's really the key to long-lasting proof of concept with large companies, is get that size match right in the first place. And then the second part is making sure that you're leading with education, that they're seeing you as a true expert and not just a vendor. And the way you get out of the vendor box is leading with being seen as a consultant, a teacher, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, and for sure a thought leader on the unique aspects of data center engineering that you specialize in. That's especially valuable for a certain kind of company and a certain geographic region that's in a certain size and a certain industry, and for very specialized stakeholders within that kind of industry. And again, the smaller you are, the more I would be super concerned with being hyper specific about that and really, really dialing it in if you want to make sure that your proof of concept projects are long lasting, meaning that you convert more of those proof of concept projects into long-term client engagements. So and then from there, we build a go-to-market around that, getting clear on your ideal client profiles, your buyer personas, their biggest goals and challenges at the intersection of data center engineering and what you do, and figuring out a way over an extended period of time to regularly educate and build trust with the key stakeholders in those accounts. So that's what I'd be thinking about when it comes to how a data center engineering firm can create long-lasting proof of concept with large corporations. Are you a large corporation? If not, you probably want to be doing proof of concept with small to mid-size corporations to have everything line up well with your value and what they're expecting from a company that provides data center engineering. So that's what I'd be thinking about. And that's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you were getting good value, if you've gotten good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on. If you want to get notified about upcoming educational events, if you want to stay in the loop about upcoming data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A shows and related training event opportunities, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder and CEO of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be sure to mention in the LinkedIn connection invite that you watch and that you're a fan of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, so I can prioritize your invitation. I'm so glad that you joined us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. We wish you, your team, and your company tremendous success in growing and capitalizing on these enormous opportunities right now in data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.